Okay, so let's unpack this claim a little bit. So if I show you back number 3 again in a way that's ambiguous, where I'm not pre-labeling who or the trace as to who it's attached to. If I say English has a low attachment preference in processing, um, what that means is that when we are parsing or processing number 3, we have to decide where the relative clause attaches to. Now keep in mind, what does parsing mean, right? Parsing is a version of processing, right? Processing is online language use. Parsing is the version where you're hearing or reading somehow, or I guess receiving signs, somehow getting input. And you as the listener, in an attempt to understand it, have to impose structure upon what you're receiving. And as the listener, I could impose 2 types of structure on 3. I could impose a tree where the relative clause is attached to the assistant, high attachment, or I could impose upon it a tree in which the relative clause is attached to scientist. Okay, so I have to give it some kind of structure, and since it's ambiguous, I could hypothetically pick either, right? There are probably semantic contexts where assistant makes so much more sense, regardless of the fact that I have the option of the scientist assistant. There are contexts, right? Like, the scientist is the laziest person I have ever met, and I just spoke to the assistant of the scientist who worked all weekend. Much more likely you're gonna go, oh, it's the assistant, right? Okay. But if you just give it to Cole with no context, you're more likely to pick the scientist. Okay. So again, here we see our first option is the object, or option 2 is the oblique DP. I'm just flashing these words at you so it's really clear when you're doing your homework. But this is what we're calling high attachment, the object, and low attachment, the oblique, because the object is higher than the oblique DP is. Yeah? Okay. So these examples, and here's 3 and 4 pre-coded with the 2 different interpretations. What's interesting, as I told you, English has a preference for low attachment. That's not true of all languages. Some languages have high attachment preferences, like Spanish or Dutch or French, right? But there are other languages besides English that have a preference for low attachment. Romanian, Basque, and then English, of course. And there's lots more. You know, this has been replicated in lots and lots of languages. And so sometimes you're reading an article and it's like, and Chinese does this, and Japanese does that, and Turkish is like this, and German is like that, and Mayan is, well, I don't know if you've done Mayan, but lots of languages. I think Croatian is in this list, and Serbian. Anyway, this has been replicated in lots of different languages, and on average, a language prefers one or the other. In particular, we're going to look at some data about Spanish and English. We're going to look at, well, the monolinguals, you already know what they do. We're going to look at second language learners, and we're going to look at early bilinguals, because this is a huge question. If you have 2 languages with different preferences, what happens when you come across something like this? Do you parse them and say it different? Like one of the languages, like the other language? That's a huge question. So give an example like 3, when it's totally ambiguous, right? And I'm showing you both just so you remember that blue is high attachment and red is low attachment. So native speakers of Spanish who have learned English have been found to continue to prefer high attachment like their native Spanish. Unless, and this isn't their L2 language, unless they're consistently immersed in English, right? So they've moved here. A lot of this research gets done on graduate students. Not all of it. But imagine someone moves here from a Spanish-speaking country and they're in English constantly, every day. Those people do not continue to use high attachment. And in fact, they start using low attachment. And not just in English, but in their Spanish too. Huh, that's interesting, right? So learning a second language can swap your processing strategy in your first language. Not necessarily what we would expect. And in fact, early bilinguals have also been tested. Fernandez 2003, you'll see again cited at the bottom, is where it's a nice book with lots of stuff in it. So an early Spanish-English bilingual population, and this is the sequential type by 6, the preference differs by how you test it. And that asks a lot of questions too. So you would think an online measure like reading times, which is often what got done for the L2 people, that you would see a difference. And If you don't, if I'm not positive how much detail you guys have spent talking about reading times, but online testing of processing, you're looking for slowdowns when you see something unexpected. So you would test this by giving someone um, a relative clause like you would see in 3, except for there would be something in the inside the clause that would force one reading or the other. And if that reading were not the reading you already had, you would have a slowdown and we go, whoa, hang on. Um, Whereas if that forced reading was in line with what you'd already parsed, you wouldn't need to reanalyze and you would have no slowdown. Um, Considering that English 4 is the preferred reading, it would be something like, I spoke to the assistant of the scientist who worked all weekend for that jerk. And you go, wait, that jerk? For that jerk? Is that the assistant? That would cause you to slow down because your brain would go, oh, that's not what I was assuming. It's not the scientist. It must be the. So that sort of data where you force the other reading usually is something that for second language learners you're seeing a difference, right? You're causing some of those preferences to show up. For the early bilinguals, you don't get that difference in that online reading times. Where you do see a difference for early bilinguals is what they call offline measures, typical laboratory, pen and paper, or yes, no, untimed things, right? So if you do an interpretation task, like we did at the beginning, where I give you example 3 without any color coding, and I say, who worked all weekend? That's an offline interpretation task. And if I do that task, I do see a difference for early bilinguals. You find that preference will reflect your dominant or stronger language. So if you're stronger in your Spanish as an early bilingual, and some people are, right? If you're bilingual and you live in Mexico, you might have stronger Spanish, and you will prefer high attachment for English and Spanish. If you are stronger in English, so you live here, but you're early bilingual, you are going to have low attachment in both languages, okay? So just to kind of put these groups together at a glance, the monolingual English group prefers low attachment, the oblique, right? And the monolingual Spanish prefers high attachment, the object. As we saw, native speakers of Spanish who have learned English, their attachment reflects the language of immersion of both languages. They'll continue to use their L1 unless they're highly immersed in their L2, right? But notice how they're doing them both together. They're either both like the L1 or both like the L2. The early bilinguals are doing something similar. You're either getting no preference at all, but that's the same for both languages, or you're getting attachment preference that reflects whatever their dominance is, whatever their stronger language is. So if I ask the question, is there an effect for a critical period? And this was our question, right? Remember, I said that if critical period is what makes L2 different from monolingual, you would expect L2 to be totally unlike early bilinguals. But if it's the coexistence of two languages in the mind that causes you to be different from monolinguals, then by George, they should be like early bilinguals. And I would say tentatively, that's what we found, right? If the question is if there's an effect for the critical period, tentatively my answer to that question is no, right? Both the L2s and the early bilinguals only have one strategy in both languages, and it relates to something like exposure, right? Either exposure that results in dominance or exposure that's literally immersion. And so honestly, I would say, at least in processing, critical period is not what's causing the difference. All right, great. Here's your works cited. Send me any questions, and I think the quiz is due on Sunday.